What if everything you thought you knew about strength was wrong? What if the person sitting quietly in the corner, the one everyone overlooks, carries within them a power so devastating that it could shatter every assumption you've ever made about human capability? This is the story of Marcus Rivera, a man whose gentle demeanor and soft-spoken nature made him the target of mockery and underestimation his entire life. From childhood bullies to corporate colleagues, everyone saw the same thing: weakness. They saw a man who apologized too much, who avoided confrontation, who seemed to bend under pressure like a reed in the wind. But what they didn't see was the truth hidden beneath the surface. They didn't know about the classified missions in the mountains of Afghanistan. They didn't know about the night he single-handedly extracted 7 hostages from a Taliban stronghold. They didn't know that behind those quiet eyes lay the mind of a Navy SEAL who had been trained to become a living weapon. Sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones who look the least dangerous. Sometimes, the strongest among us are those who choose to appear weak. And sometimes, when pushed too far, even the most patient soul reaches a breaking point where silence transforms into thunder. This is that story. This is the moment when assumptions shattered like glass, when laughter turned to shock, and when a room full of people learned that underestimating someone can be the most dangerous mistake you'll ever make. Welcome to the day Marcus Rivera stopped hiding who he really was. Marcus Rivera had always been the invisible man in every room he entered. At 34, he carried himself with a humility that most people mistook for weakness. His shoulders were slightly hunched, not from poor posture, but from years of consciously making himself appear smaller, less threatening, more approachable. When he walked into the corporate offices of Henderson and Associates that Tuesday morning, no one gave him a second glance. The consulting firm buzzed with the usual energy of ambitious professionals climbing the corporate ladder. Marcus made his way to his modest cubicle, passing by colleagues who barely acknowledged his presence. He preferred it that way. Invisibility had become his armor, a carefully constructed shield that protected not others from him, but him from the complications that came with being truly seen. "Morning, Marcus," Sarah from accounting called out, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they're being polite but not really interested. Marcus nodded and smiled. That same gentle smile that had fooled everyone for the past 3 years since he'd started working there. He settled into his chair and opened his laptop, the screen illuminating a face that told a story most people couldn't read. There were faint lines around his eyes, not from age, but from squinting through desert dust and mountain snow. A small scar above his left eyebrow, barely visible, was a souvenir from shrapnel that had missed killing him by inches. His hands, clean and soft-looking now, still carried calluses in places where most office workers would never develop them. The morning passed quietly, as most of his mornings did. Marcus worked on budget analysis spreadsheets, attended routine meetings where he spoke only when directly addressed, and ate lunch alone while reading a paperback novel. To everyone around him, he was exactly what he appeared to be: a mild-mannered analyst who was competent enough to keep his job, but unremarkable enough to never stand out. But appearances, as Marcus knew better than most, could be devastatingly deceptive. The trouble began at 2:47 p.m., during what should have been a routine quarterly review meeting. The conference room was packed with 15 people, including several executives from the company's main office. Marcus sat in his usual spot at the far end of the table, notebook open, pen ready, trying his best to blend into the beige walls. The meeting was led by Richard Blackstone, the regional director who had flown in from New York specifically for these reviews. Blackstone was everything Marcus appeared not to be: tall, broad-shouldered, commanding, with a voice that filled rooms and a presence that demanded attention. He wore his authority like an expensive suit, and he had a reputation for being ruthless with underperformers. "Now," Blackstone said, consulting his tablet, "let's discuss the Henderson account discrepancies. Rivera, you were the primary analyst on this project." Marcus looked up from his notes, feeling the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with being the center of attention.
"Yes, sir."
The discrepancies were due to a change in their reporting structure mid-quarter. I've prepared a detailed breakdown that shows. "I'm not interested in excuses," Blackstone interrupted, his voice sharp. "I'm interested in results. And according to this report, Your analysis cost us credibility with a major client." The room fell silent. Marcus felt heat rising in his cheeks, but he kept his voice steady. "Sir, with respect, the analysis was accurate based on the information available at the time. When Henderson changed their participant, are you arguing with me?" Blackstone's eyebrows shot up, and he leaned forward in his chair. "Because it sounds like you're arguing with me, Rivera." Marcus shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I'm just trying to explain the circumstances." "The circumstances," Blackstone repeated, his voice dripping with condescension, "are that you failed to anticipate a basic change in client operations. The circumstances are that your lack of thoroughness made this company look incompetent." Around the table, Marcus's colleagues shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at their hands, others at their laptops, anywhere but at the scene unfolding before them. This wasn't unusual for Blackstone, who was known for his public dressing downs, but something about this felt different, more personal. Furthermore, Blackstone continued, warming to his theme, "I've been reviewing your performance over the past year, and frankly, I'm not impressed. You lack initiative, you avoid taking leadership roles, and when pressed, you fold like a house of cards." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing. Blackstone stood up and began pacing behind his chair, clearly enjoying the audience. "You know what your problem is, Rivera. You're soft. You're weak. In this business, you need to have backbone, and you just don't have it." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus stared at the table in front of him, his breathing slow and controlled. In his peripheral vision, he could see his colleagues' faces, some embarrassed for him, others relieved that they weren't in his position. "I mean, look at you," Blackstone continued, gesturing toward Marcus with theatrical disdain. "You can barely make eye contact. You apologize for everything. You let people walk all over you. How is someone like that supposed to represent this company to our clients?" Something shifted in the room's atmosphere, though only Marcus seemed to sense it. It was like the change in air pressure before a storm, subtle but unmistakable. His hands, folded calmly on the table, didn't move, but something behind his eyes began to sharpen. "Sir?" Marcus said quietly, his voice so soft that Blackstone had to stop talking to hear him. "I understand your concerns about my performance." "Finally," Blackstone said with a snort, "a bit of acknowledgement." "But," Marcus continued, still in that same quiet voice, "I think there might be some information missing from your assessment." Blackstone's eyes narrowed. "Information? What kind of information?" Marcus slowly lifted his head and met Blackstone's gaze directly for the first time in the meeting. "Information about what weakness actually looks like." The room went completely still. There was something in Marcus's tone, something that made everyone suddenly pay attention. It wasn't louder, wasn't more aggressive, but it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Blackstone laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, this should be good. Please, Rivera, enlighten us. Tell us what weakness looks like." Marcus stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. As he rose to his full height, people in the room seemed to notice for the first time that he wasn't as small as they'd always thought. His frame, while not imposing, had a solidity to it that suggested hidden strength. "Weakness," Marcus said, his voice still quiet, but somehow commanding the entire room's attention, "is assuming you know someone's capabilities based on their behavior in a corporate meeting. Weakness is confusing humility with inability. Weakness is mistaking someone's choice to remain calm for an inability to be otherwise." Blackstone's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on. "Big words from someone who can't even defend a simple budget analysis." Marcus nodded slowly, as if considering this point. "You're right. I should have defended my analysis more aggressively. Just like I should have mentioned that the Henderson account irregularities weren't due to my oversight, but to their CFO embezzling funds and manipulating their reporting structure to cover it up." The room erupted in murmurs. Blackstone's face reddened. "That's a serious accusation, Rivera. Do you have proof?" Marcus reached into his folder and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "FBI Financial Crimes Division is handling the investigation. Henderson's CFO was arrested yesterday morning. The irregularities in my analysis were actually the evidence they needed to build their case. He slid the envelope across the table to Blackstone, who opened it with increasingly shaky hands. Inside were official documents, correspondence with federal investigators, and commendations from both Henderson's board of directors and the FBI. I couldn't mention the investigation while it was ongoing, Marcus explained calmly. Federal law. But since arrests have been made, I'm free to discuss my role as a cooperating witness. Blackstone's face had gone from red to pale. Around the table, Marcus's colleagues were staring at him with newfound respect and amazement. The quiet analyst they'd worked beside for 3 years had just revealed himself to be a key figure in a federal investigation. However, Marcus continued, his voice taking on an edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Your comments about weakness concern me more than your misunderstanding of the Henderson situation. He began walking slowly around the table, his movements fluid and purposeful. For the first time, people noticed how he moved, not with the shuffling uncertainty of a timid office worker, but with the controlled precision of someone who had been trained to move with deadly efficiency. You see, Mr. Blackstone, I've encountered real weakness before. I've seen it in the faces of men who talk tough until they're faced with genuine danger. I've seen it in the trembling hands of bullies who crumble the moment they realize their target might fight back. Blackstone tried to regain control of the situation. Rivera, I think you're overreacting to some constructive criticism. Am I? Marcus stopped directly in front of Blackstone, close enough that the taller man had to look down to meet his eyes, because it sounded less like constructive criticism and more like public humiliation designed to make you feel powerful. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Marcus's colleagues watched in fascination and growing alarm as their mild-mannered co-worker transformed before their eyes into someone entirely different. You want to know what real strength looks like? Marcus asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Real strength is choosing not to use your capabilities when you don't need to. Real strength is letting people underestimate you because you don't need their validation to know who you are. He stepped back, giving Blackstone space, but somehow his presence seemed to fill the room even more. Real strength is spending 8 years in naval special warfare, completing missions that remain classified, and then coming home and choosing to build spreadsheets instead of breaking things. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute. Every person in the room was staring at Marcus with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The quiet analyst, the man they'd all dismissed as weak and unremarkable, had just revealed himself to be a Navy SEAL. Blackstone's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. He looked like a man who had just discovered he'd been poking a sleeping tiger with a stick. Marcus returned to his seat and calmly closed his notebook. I've always believed that actions speak louder than words, Mr. Blackstone. But sometimes words are necessary to correct dangerous misconceptions. He stood again and looked around the room, making brief eye contact with each of his colleagues. I apologize if I've made anyone uncomfortable. That wasn't my intention. My intention was simply to ensure that Mr. Blackstone understood the difference between choosing to be quiet and being weak. As Marcus gathered his papers, the room remained frozen in stunned silence. Nobody knew what to say or how to react to this dramatic transformation of someone they thought they knew. But this was only the beginning. The quiet man's shadow had been lifted, and what lay beneath would challenge everything everyone in that room thought they knew about: strength, weakness, and the dangerous assumption that you can judge a person's capabilities by their willingness to display them. The meeting that was supposed to end Marcus Rivera's career had instead begun the most extraordinary chapter of his civilian life. The aftermath of the meeting spread through Henderson and Associates like wildfire. Within an hour, every employee on every floor had heard some version of the story. Marcus Rivera, the quiet analyst from the 3rd floor, was a Navy SEAL. The man who brought homemade sandwiches to work and always volunteered to stay late when deadlines loomed had spent 8 years in one of the most elite military units in the world. Marcus himself seemed unaffected by the chaos his revelation had created. He returned to his cubicle, opened his laptop, and continued working on quarterly projections as if nothing had happened. But around him, the office buzzed with whispered conversations and stolen glances. Colleagues who had barely noticed him for 3 years now found excuses to walk past his desk, trying to reconcile the mild-mannered man they knew with the warrior he claimed to have been. Sarah from accounting was the first to approach him directly. She knocked softly on his cubicle wall, her usual confidence replaced by obvious nervousness. "Marcus?" she said tentatively. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but is it really true about the Navy SEAL thing?" Marcus looked up from his screen and gave her the same gentle smile she'd seen hundreds of times before. Nothing about his demeanor had changed, which somehow made the whole situation even more surreal. "It's true," he said simply, then returned to his spreadsheet. Sarah lingered, clearly wanting to ask more questions but not knowing how. Finally, she said, "Why didn't you ever mention it?" Marcus paused his typing and considered the question. "For the same reason you probably don't tell everyone about your divorce or your struggles with anxiety. Some experiences are too important to use as small talk." The observation was gentle but perceptive, and Sarah realized he was right about both her divorce and her anxiety issues, things she'd never discussed at work but somehow he'd noticed. She walked away feeling both impressed and slightly unsettled. Meanwhile, Richard Blackstone had barricaded himself in the conference room, frantically making phone calls to his superiors in New York. The conversation wasn't going well. "What do you mean he's telling the truth?" Blackstone hissed into his phone, trying to keep his voice low. "How was I supposed to know he was some kind of war hero?" The voice on the other end was crisp and unsympathetic. "Richard, it's your job to know your employees. And from what I'm hearing, this Rivera character isn't just any former serviceman. We're getting calls from some very important people." Blackstone's face went pale. "What kind of calls?" "The kind that come from people who make decisions about our government contracts. Apparently, Marcus Rivera has some very influential friends who are not happy about his treatment in your meeting today." The phone call ended 20 minutes later with Blackstone's job hanging by a thread and strict instructions to make things right with Marcus immediately. But as he would soon discover, making things right with a man you've publicly humiliated wasn't going to be as simple as an apology. By 5 o'clock, most of the office had cleared out, but Marcus remained at his desk, working through a complex financial model. The building was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of cleaning crew members beginning their evening rounds. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice the figure approaching his cubicle until a shadow fell across his desk. Looking up, he saw Detective Ray Kowalski, a thick-set man in his 50s, wearing a rumpled suit and a concerned expression. "Marcus Rivera?" the detective asked, showing his badge. Marcus saved his work and gave the detective his full attention. "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem?" Kowalski pulled up a chair from the neighboring cubicle and sat down heavily. "That's what I'm here to find out. We got a call this afternoon about some kind of incident at your workplace. Someone claimed you made threatening statements." A slow smile spread across Marcus's face, the first genuine emotion he'd shown all day. "Let me guess. Richard Blackstone called you." "Can't reveal the source of the complaint," Kowalski said officially, but his expression suggested Marcus's guess was accurate. "He claimed you intimidated him with references to your military background and implied physical violence." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the detective's face. After a moment, he asked, "What did you think of Mr. Blackstone when he made this complaint?" Kowalski shifted uncomfortably. "Not sure what you mean. I mean, did he strike you as a man who was genuinely afraid for his safety, or as someone who was embarrassed and looking for a way to turn himself into a victim?" The question hung in the air between them. Kowalski had been a cop for 26 years, and his instincts about people were usually reliable. Richard Blackstone had indeed struck him as a man whose pride had been wounded rather than someone who felt physically threatened. "I'm required to investigate all complaints," Kowalski said carefully. Marcus nodded. "Of course. What would you like to know?" "Start with what happened in that meeting today." Over the next 30 minutes, Marcus recounted the events in the conference room with precise, factual language. He didn't embellish or editorialize, simply stated what had been said and done. When he finished, Kowalski was quiet for a long moment. "You know," the detective said finally, "I served 2 Army, not Navy. Did 2 tours in Iraq before I became a cop." Marcus waited, sensing there was more coming. "Thing that always bothered me about civilians," Kowalski continued, "is how they think military service is either something to worship or something to fear. They can't just see it as a job that some people did and then moved on from." "It's not just a job," Marcus said quietly. "But it's also not a costume I wear to impress people, or a weapon I wave around when someone hurts my feelings." Kowalski nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I thought you'd say." He stood up and extended his hand. "Thank you for your service, Marcus. And for your patience with this nonsense." As the detective prepared to leave, he turned back one more time. "Word of advice? Your boss is scared. Scared people sometimes do stupid things to try to regain control. Watch yourself." After Kowalski left, Marcus returned to his work, but his mind kept drifting to the detective's warning. He'd dealt with scared people before, in far more dangerous situations than an office building in downtown Seattle. The problem with fear was that it made people unpredictable, and unpredictable people were often more dangerous than openly hostile ones. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Heard you had an interesting day. Coffee tomorrow?" Jessica Marcus stared at the message for several seconds before typing back. "How did you get this number?" The response came immediately. "Same way I always get what I need." "You know who this is." Marcus did know, and the knowledge sent a chill down his spine. He typed, "I'm not interested in reconnecting, Johnson. This isn't about the past, Rivera. This is about your future. Someone's been asking questions about your service record. Questions that could cause problems for all of us." Marcus's blood ran cold. His service record was classified at levels that should have made it impossible for civilian inquiries to access. If someone was asking questions, it meant they had connections and resources that posed a serious threat. He typed, "What kind of questions? The kind that get asked when someone wants to make sure you can't hide behind your quiet civilian life anymore. Meet me at Pike Place Market tomorrow at noon. The fish throwing stand." Before Marcus could respond, another message came through. "And Rivera? Bring your A game. You're about to remember why you left the teams in the first place." The messages stopped after that, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and a growing sense that his carefully constructed peaceful life was about to become much more complicated. He finished his work and gathered his things, moving through the empty office with the same quiet efficiency he'd always displayed. But now, in the silence and shadows, something else was visible in his movements. The casual awareness of his surroundings, the way his eyes automatically noted exit routes and potential threats, the subtle tenseness in his shoulders that suggested a predator at rest rather than a sheep in hiding. As he waited for the elevator, Marcus caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. For 3 years, he'd seen the face of a mild-mannered corporate analyst staring back at him. Tonight, for the first time, he saw traces of the person he used to be, the person Richard Blackstone and others like him had no idea they were dealing with. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime and Marcus stepped inside. As the car descended toward the parking garage, he found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had with his team leader 8 years ago, on the night before his final mission. "The thing about being a SEAL," Lieutenant Commander Walsh had said, "is that you never really stop being one. You might change your job, change your address, change your whole life, but the training, the instincts, the capability that stays with you forever. And someday, whether you want it to or not, you might need to use it again." Marcus had thought Walsh was wrong. He'd believed that his transition to civilian life was complete, that Marcus Rivera, the analyst, had successfully replaced Petty Officer Rivera, the warrior. But as he walked through the parking garage toward his modest sedan, every shadow seemed to hold potential threats, every sound seemed significant, and every instinct honed by years of dangerous missions was suddenly sharp and alert again. Richard Blackstone's humiliation had been intended to break Marcus down, to expose his weakness and establish dominance. Instead, it had awakened something that had been sleeping for 8 years. And now, with mysterious messages from his past and questions being asked about his classified service record, Marcus was beginning to realize that his transformation might not be voluntary anymore. The quiet man was disappearing, and what was taking his place was something far more complex and potentially dangerous than anyone at Henderson and Associates could possibly imagine. Pike Place Market at noon was a chaos of tourists, vendors, and flying salmon. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, using the time to scout the location and identify potential escape routes. Old habits died hard, and after yesterday's revelations, those habits were reasserting themselves with startling clarity. He positioned himself near the famous fish-throwing stand, watching the vendors hurl massive salmon through the air to delighted customers while his eyes systematically scanned the crowd. He spotted Johnson before Johnson spotted him, which was exactly how he'd intended it. Commander Jake Johnson looked exactly the same as he had 8 years ago, tall, lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a navy sweater, but he moved with the same predatory grace that had made him legendary in special operations circles. "Rivera," Johnson said as he approached, not bothering with pleasantries. "You look soft." "You look old," Marcus replied evenly. "What do you want, Commander?" Johnson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Still calling me Commander. Some habits die harder than others, don't they?" He gestured toward a coffee stand away from the main crowd, and they walked over together. Two men who had once trusted each other with their lives now circling each other like wary predators. "You've made some waves," Johnson said as they ordered coffee. "Important people are asking questions about you." "What kind of important people?" "The kind who don't like surprises. The kind who thought you were safely tucked away in corporate anonymity where you couldn't cause problems." Marcus accepted his coffee and studied Johnson's face. "I haven't caused any problems. I defended myself when someone attacked my professional competence, that's all." Johnson laughed, a sound without humor. "Rivera, when you're Marcus Rivera, mild-mannered analyst, that might be all it was. But when you're Petty Officer First Class Marcus Rivera, holder of 2 Silver Stars and a Navy Cross, veteran of Operation Neptune's Fury, suddenly it becomes something else entirely." The mention of Neptune's Fury hit Marcus like a physical blow. That operation had been classified at levels so high that even most military personnel didn't know it existed. The fact that Johnson was discussing it in public, even obliquely, meant the situation was far more serious than he'd imagined. "That operation never happened," Marcus said quietly. "Officially, you're right. Unofficially, certain people are very concerned that your sudden willingness to discuss your military background might lead to questions about what you did during those 8 years." They found a table away from the main foot traffic, and Johnson leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 3 days ago, a reporter from the Seattle Times started asking questions about you. Wanted to do a human interest story about the Navy SEAL working as a corporate analyst. Someone killed that story before it could run, but not before she'd started digging. Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. "How much did she find?" "Enough to know that your service record has gaps. Enough to know that for 2 years you didn't officially exist. Enough to start asking why." The gaps in Marcus's record weren't accidental. They covered the period when he'd been part of a joint task force so classified that the participants had been temporarily removed from official military records. The missions they'd conducted during that time had prevented terrorist attacks, eliminated high-value targets, and saved countless lives. They had also violated several international laws and treaties. "Who killed the story?" Marcus asked. "People with more power than either of us want to mess with. But here's the problem. Killing a story like that creates more questions than it answers. Now, there are 3 different agencies trying to figure out what's so important about Marcus Rivera that someone would use that level of influence to shut down a simple human interest piece." Johnson pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a photograph. It was grainy, obviously taken from a distance, but it clearly showed Marcus leaving his apartment building that morning. This was taken by a private investigator hired by Richard Blackstone. "Your boss is so angry about being humiliated that he's paying money to dig up dirt on you." Marcus stared at the photo, feeling the last vestiges of his peaceful civilian life crumbling away. What did the investigator find? More than Blackstone bargained for. Your real address, your real background, and enough questions about your classified service that he got scared and tried to back out. But the investigator kept digging on his own dime. Johnson swiped to the next photo, this one showing Marcus at a coffee shop near his office. Timothy Marsh, former police detective, now working private security. He's good at his job, and he's persistent. He's also completely out of his depth, but he doesn't know it yet. Where is he now? That's the million-dollar question. He disappeared yesterday, right around the time certain people found out what he was investigating. The implications hung heavy between them. Marcus knew the world Johnson was describing, a shadow realm where inconvenient people disappeared and uncomfortable questions were answered with permanent silence. "What do they want from me?" Marcus asked. Johnson's expression grew grim. "They want you to disappear again. Not permanently, not unless you force their hand. But they want Marcus Rivera, the analyst, to have some kind of breakdown, maybe take early retirement, move somewhere quiet, and never draw attention to himself again. And if I refuse, then they'll make it happen anyway, and it won't be as pleasant for you." Marcus sat back in his chair, processing the information. Around them, the market continued its cheerful chaos, tourists snapping photos and vendors hawking their wares, completely oblivious to the life-and-death conversation taking place at a simple coffee table. "There's something else," Johnson continued. "The reason I'm here instead of some nameless government flunky is that they need someone you trust to deliver the message." "I don't trust you," Marcus said flatly. Johnson smiled, and this time it was genuine. "Smart man, you shouldn't. But you know I'll tell you the truth, even when it's not what you want to hear." He was right about that. Johnson had been a hard commander but a fair one, someone who demanded excellence but never lied to his men about the costs. "The truth is, Rivera, you've got 3 choices. Option 1, accept their offer, take early retirement, and live quietly somewhere far from Seattle. They'll make sure you're comfortable, give you a new identity if necessary, and you'll be left alone as long as you stay invisible." Marcus waited for the other options. Option 2, refuse their offer and try to fight. "You'll lose eventually, but they'll probably let you live if you don't cause too much trouble. You'll just find that life becomes very difficult very quickly." "And option 3? Johnson's eyes hardened. "Option 3 is that you remember who you used to be and handle this the way the old Marcus Rivera would have handled it." The suggestion hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Marcus knew exactly what Johnson was implying, and the idea both terrified and exhilarated him. "I'm not that person anymore," he said quietly. "Aren't you? Because from what I heard about your little performance yesterday, it sounds like that person is still very much alive." Johnson stood up and dropped a business card on the table. "They want an answer by tomorrow night. Call me when you decide." As Johnson walked away, Marcus picked up the card. It was blank except for a phone number, but he recognized the format. Disposable phone, encrypted communication, the tools of his former trade. He sat alone for another hour, watching the crowds and thinking about the choice he faced. 8 years ago, he'd left the teams because he'd grown tired of living in a world where problems were solved with violence and secrecy. He'd wanted a normal life, a quiet life, a life where the most dangerous thing he faced was a hostile budget meeting. But normal lives, he was beginning to realize, were a luxury that some people were never allowed to have. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Rivera, this is Timothy Marsh. I need to speak with you immediately. I have information about your military service that puts both of us in danger. Meet me at the Starbucks on Pine Street at 3 p.m. Come alone and make sure you're not followed." Marcus stared at the message, his blood running cold. If Johnson was right and Marsh had disappeared, then someone else was using the investigator's phone. Someone who wanted to draw Marcus into a trap. But if Johnson was lying or mistaken, and Marsh was still alive and trying to reach out, then ignoring the message could mean letting an innocent man die for the crime of asking too many questions about Marcus Rivera's past. He looked around the market, suddenly seeing potential threats in every face, possible surveillance in every casual glance. The cheerful chaos that had seemed so innocent an hour ago now felt like a carefully orchestrated cover for watchers and hunters. For 8 years, Marcus had successfully hidden from his past. He built a new identity, created a peaceful life, and convinced himself that the warrior he'd been was gone forever. But hiding required cooperation from the people you were hiding from, and it was becoming clear that cooperation was about to end. As he left Pike Place Market and headed toward his car, Marcus found himself walking differently. His steps were lighter, his awareness sharper, his body unconsciously falling into the movement patterns that had once been second nature. The quiet man was still there, still choosing restraint and peace when possible, but underneath that careful facade, something else was stirring to life. Something that had been trained to fight when peace was no longer an option. something that was very good at making problems disappear permanently when they threatened the people and principles he'd sworn to protect. The meeting with the mysterious text sender was still 2 hours away, but Marcus already knew he was going to attend, not because he was reckless or eager for confrontation, but because running away was no longer an option. His carefully constructed civilian life was unraveling, and he was going to have to decide whether to let it collapse quietly or to fight for the right to choose his own fate. As he drove through the Seattle streets toward an uncertain confrontation, Marcus Rivera realized that the most dangerous person in the city might very well be the quiet man who had spent 8 years pretending he was weak. The Starbucks on Pine Street was packed with the usual afternoon crowd. Students with laptops, business people grabbing caffeine fixes, and tourists consulting maps and guidebooks. Marcus arrived 20 minutes early, ordered a black coffee, and chose a table with clear sight lines to all entrances and exits. He'd spent the drive analyzing the situation from every angle. If this was a trap, the most likely scenario was that hostile actors had captured Timothy Marsh and were using his phone to lure Marcus into an ambush. If it wasn't a trap, then a private investigator had stumbled into classified territory and was panicking about the consequences. Either way, the meeting was dangerous. Marcus positioned himself where he could watch the entrance while appearing to read a newspaper. His coffee sat untouched as he systematically cataloged every person in the cafe, looking for signs of surveillance or hostile intent. At 2:55 p.m., a nervous-looking man in his 40s entered the coffee shop. He was average height, slightly overweight, with thinning hair and the tired eyes of someone who hadn't slept in days. He wore wrinkled khakis and a blue button-down shirt, and he kept checking over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. The man ordered a large coffee with shaking hands, spilled sugar while trying to add sweetener, and then approached Marcus's table with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Rivera?" he asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Marcus looked up from his newspaper and nodded. "Mr. Marsh, I assume?" Timothy Marsh collapsed into the chair across from Marcus, his relief evident. "Thank God you came. I wasn't sure if you'd gotten my message or if you'd think it was safe to meet." Marcus studied Marsh's face carefully. The man's fear appeared genuine, his nervous energy consistent with someone who had stumbled into a situation far beyond his experience. But appearances could be deceiving, and Marcus had learned long ago to trust his instincts over his initial impressions. "You said you had information about my military service," Marcus said calmly. "What kind of information?" Marsh glanced around the coffee shop nervously before pulling out a manila folder. "I was hired by Richard Blackstone to investigate your background. Standard employment verification," he said. "Look for anything that might be grounds for termination." He opened the folder and showed Marcus several documents. At first, everything seemed normal. Birth certificate, education records, employment history. But then I started looking into your military service. And that's when things got weird. Marcus remained silent, letting Marsh continue. "Your service record has gaps, Mr. Rivera. Big ones. According to official documents, you enlisted in the Navy in 2010, completed SEAL training in 2012, and then for nearly 2 years you just disappear." Marsh pulled out a timeline he'd constructed, with red circles around the missing periods. No deployment records, no training assignments, no medical evaluations. It's like you didn't exist from March 2014 to January 2016. "Maybe the records were lost," Marcus suggested mildly. Marsh shook his head vigorously. "That's what I thought at first, but I've worked with military records before. They don't just lose entire blocks of service history for decorated personnel. And you are decorated, Mr. Rivera. Very decorated." He showed Marcus photocopies of commendation letters and medal citations. Silver Star for actions in Afghanistan. Another Silver Star for a classified operation in Syria. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in circumstances that remain classified to this day. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but internally he was calculating. The documents Marsh was showing him should have been impossible for a civilian investigator to access. Either Marsh had connections he wasn't revealing, or someone had provided him with the information for reasons that had nothing to do with a simple employment background check. "Where did you get these documents?" Marcus asked. "That's the thing," Marsh said, his voice dropping even lower. "I didn't get them through normal channels. They were delivered to my office yesterday morning by a courier. No return address. No explanation. Just a note saying that if I wanted to know the truth about Marcus Rivera, I should look at these files. Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. Someone was playing a complex game, using Marsh as a pawn to draw Marcus out into the open. The question was who and what they ultimately wanted. The courier, Marcus said. Can you describe him? Her, Marsh corrected. Tall woman, maybe 35, dark hair, professional clothes. She said she worked for a law firm, but when I tried to call the number on her business card later, it was disconnected. Marcus nodded, filing away the description. What else did the documents tell you? Marsh hesitated, then pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is what really scared me. It's a personnel transfer order, dated January 15, 2016. It transfers you from something called Task Force Omega back to regular SEAL team operations. The mention of Task Force Omega sent a chill down Marcus's spine. That designation had been so highly classified that even knowing it existed was a federal crime for unauthorized personnel. Marsh. Marcus said carefully, I think you need to understand that you're in serious danger. The information you've uncovered could get you killed. Marsh's face went pale, but he pressed on. That's not the worst part. After I received these documents, I started getting phone calls, anonymous voices telling me to stop investigating you, to destroy the files, to pretend I never heard your name. He pulled out his cell phone and showed Marcus his call log. 17 calls yesterday alone, all from different numbers, all untraceable. But the message was the same. Drop the investigation or face consequences. Marcus was beginning to understand the scope of the trap that was being laid. Someone wanted him to know that his classified background was being exposed, that innocent people were being threatened because of their connection to him, and that his only option was to respond in a way that would confirm he was still the dangerous operative he'd once been. There's more, Marsh continued, his voice shaking now. Last night, someone broke into my office. They didn't take anything valuable, my computer, my camera equipment, cash I had in the safe. They only took files related to my investigation of you. He leaned forward, his eyes wide with fear. Mr. Rivera, I'm a private investigator. I've dealt with cheating spouses, corporate fraud, insurance scams. But this is something else entirely. These people, whoever they are, they're serious. And I think they're using me to get to you. Marcus appreciated Marsh's honesty, but he was also beginning to suspect that the investigator wasn't as innocent as he appeared. The documents he'd been shown, the mysterious courier, the convenient timing of the break-in, it all felt orchestrated. What do you want from me? Marcus asked. I want to know what I've stumbled into, Marsh said desperately, and I want to know how to get out of it alive. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and felt his blood turn to ice. The message was simple. Look out the window. Marcus's eyes swept to the large windows facing Pine Street. Across the street, clearly visible in the afternoon light, was a black SUV with tinted windows. As he watched, the passenger window rolled down slightly, and the unmistakable glint of a telescopic sight caught the sunlight. Mr. Marsh, Marcus said quietly, not taking his eyes off the window, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. In about 30 seconds, you're going to stand up, walk calmly to the bathroom in the back of this coffee shop, and lock the door behind you. You're going to stay there until you hear sirens, and then you're going to call 911 and report that you witnessed a shooting. Marsh looked confused. A shooting? What shooting? The one that's about to happen if you don't move right now. The urgency in Marcus's voice finally penetrated Marsh's confusion. The investigator stood up shakily and headed toward the back of the coffee shop, casting nervous glances over his shoulder. Marcus remained seated, his posture relaxed, but every muscle in his body was coiled and ready. He calculated angles, distances, and cover options with the automatic precision of someone who had done this countless times before. His phone buzzed again. You have 10 seconds to walk outside alone, or we start shooting civilians. Marcus looked around the coffee shop at the innocent people going about their afternoon routines. Students studying for exams, couples sharing pastries, elderly people reading newspapers. None of them had any idea they were sitting in what was about to become a battlefield. He stood up slowly, left money on the table for his untouched coffee, and walked toward the exit with measured steps. As he reached the door, he caught the eye of a teenage barista behind the counter. "Call 911 in exactly 2 minutes," he said quietly. "Tell them there's an active shooter situation, and they need to evacuate this block." The young man looked confused, but something in Marcus's tone made him nod. Marcus stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, his hands visible and empty, his movements calm and non-threatening. The black SUV was still positioned across the street, and he could see at least 3 figures inside. His phone buzzed one final time. "Walk to the alley behind the building. Come alone, come unarmed, and maybe we can discuss this like civilized people." Marcus almost smiled at that. Civilized people didn't threaten to shoot innocent civilians to force a meeting. But he also knew that going into that alley was almost certainly a death sentence. The problem was that not going into the alley might be a death sentence for everyone in the coffee shop. As he began walking toward the alley, Marcus felt the last vestiges of his civilian identity falling away like an old coat. For 8 years, he'd been Marcus Rivera, mild-mannered analyst, a man who solved problems with spreadsheets and diplomatic conversations. But the people who had orchestrated this confrontation had made a critical error in judgment. They'd assumed that drawing him into a trap would give them control of the situation. What they didn't realize was that Marcus Rivera hadn't spent 8 years hiding from his past. He'd spent 8 years preparing for the day when his past would find him again. And that day, it seemed, had finally arrived. As he turned into the alley behind the coffee shop, Marcus Rivera, Navy SEAL, began to remember exactly who he used to be and why so many people had worked so hard to make sure he stayed hidden. The trap was springing, but the hunters were about to discover they'd cornered the wrong kind of prey. The alley behind the Starbucks was narrow and shadowed, lined with dumpsters and loading docks. Marcus walked into it with steady steps, his eyes automatically cataloging every detail. The fire escape ladder hanging 12 feet up the brick wall to his left, the stack of wooden pallets that could provide cover or become improvised weapons, the storm drain grate that was loose enough to be pulled free. 3 men waited for him in the deepest part of the alley. They were professionals. That much was obvious from their positioning and bearing. The leader stood directly in front of Marcus, while the other 2 flanked him at angles that would make escape difficult. All 3 wore dark suits and sunglasses despite the overcast afternoon. "Mr. Rivera," the leader said in a voice that carried a slight Eastern European accent, "thank you for accepting our invitation." Marcus stopped about 15 feet away from them, close enough to talk, but far enough to have reaction time if things went bad. "I don't believe we've been introduced." The leader smiled, but it was the cold expression of a predator. "Names are not important. What is important is that you understand the situation you find yourself in." "I understand that you threatened to kill innocent people to get me here," Marcus replied calmly. "That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of people you are." "The kind who get results," the leader said. "The kind who solve problems that governments cannot officially acknowledge." He reached inside his jacket, moving slowly to show he wasn't drawing a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a thick manila envelope. "Your service record, Mr. Campbell, Rivera. The complete version, including the parts your own government pretends don't exist." Marcus didn't move to take the envelope. "I lived my service record. I don't need to read about it." "Perhaps not, but other people might find it very interesting reading. Journalists, for instance, or the families of certain individuals who died during Task Force Omega operations." The threat was clear, and Marcus felt a familiar coldness settling over him. It was the same emotional shutdown he'd experienced before dangerous missions, a protective mechanism that allowed him to function when normal human reactions would be a liability. "What do you want?" Marcus asked. The leader gestured to one of his companions, who stepped forward with a tablet computer. "We want you to watch something." The tablet screen showed surveillance footage of Marcus's apartment building. As he watched, he saw himself leaving that morning, completely unaware he was being monitored. The timestamp showed the video was less than 6 hours old. "We know where you live," the leader continued. "We know your routines, your habits, your vulnerabilities." The footage switched to show the interior of Henderson and Associates. Marcus watched himself sitting in the conference room meeting where this had all begun, then later working alone at his desk. "We know where you work, who you work with, and how to reach you at any time." The final piece of footage was the most disturbing. Sarah from accounting walking to her car in the parking garage, completely oblivious to the camera following her movements. We know about the people you care about, Mr. Rivera. The few friends you've allowed yourself to make during your civilian charade. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. If you hurt any innocent people, you'll what? The leader interrupted. You'll file a complaint with Human Resources? You'll call the police? You'll write a strongly worded letter? The mocking tone was designed to provoke a reaction, and Marcus recognized the psychological manipulation for what it was. They wanted him angry, wanted him to act impulsively, wanted him to confirm their belief that underneath the mild-mannered analyst was still the dangerous operative they feared. I'll do what's necessary to protect them, Marcus said quietly. The leader laughed. There it is, the real Marcus Rivera, finally showing himself. Do you feel it, Mr. Rivera? That familiar rush when everything becomes simple again? When problems become targets and targets become solved? Marcus didn't respond. But something in his stillness seemed to make the three men more alert. The flanking agents shifted their positions slightly, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. Here is what's going to happen, the leader continued. You're going to disappear. Tonight. You'll leave Seattle, leave your job, leave your carefully constructed little life, and you'll go somewhere far away where you can't cause problems for important people. And if I refuse? The leader shrugged. Then we'll arrange for Marcus Rivera to have a very public breakdown. Maybe he'll attack a coworker who reminds him of enemy combatants. Maybe he'll have flashbacks and threaten innocent civilians. Maybe he'll barricade himself in his apartment with weapons and force the police to take decisive action. The scenario was chillingly plausible. PTSD-related incidents involving veterans made headlines regularly, and the public would readily accept that a former SEAL had finally snapped under pressure. Of course, the leader added, such incidents often result in collateral damage, innocent people getting hurt when disturbed veterans lose control. Very tragic, but these things happen. The threat to his colleagues was the final straw. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him, like a switch being thrown. For 8 years, he'd chosen peace, chosen restraint, chosen to be the quiet man who solved problems with patience and diplomacy. But some problems couldn't be solved with patience. Some threats required a different kind of response. You've made a mistake, Marcus said, his voice carrying a new quality that made all three men tense. Have we? The leader asked, but his confidence was beginning to waver. You've spent so much time researching Marcus Rivera, the analyst, that you forgot to research Marcus Rivera, the SEAL. Marcus began walking toward them, his movements fluid and purposeful. You see, there's something about SEAL training that civilians never really understand. It's not just about learning to fight or learning to kill. It's about learning to function when everything goes wrong, when you're outnumbered, when you're trapped, when the only way out is through. The flanking agents were reaching for their weapons now, but Marcus was still talking, still walking forward with that same calm confidence. The thing about being cornered, Marcus continued, is that it eliminates options. And when you eliminate enough options, what's left becomes very simple. The agent on the right drew his pistol, a smooth professional motion that should have given him the advantage. But Marcus was no longer where he'd been when the draw began. He'd moved laterally and forward, closing the distance while staying inside the weapon's effective arc. What happened next lasted less than 10 seconds, but to the three agents it must have felt like an eternity. Marcus moved with a precision and efficiency that spoke of countless hours of training and real-world experience. The first agent's weapon was stripped from his hand and turned against his companion before he could register what was happening. The leader tried to run but found his path blocked by someone who moved like a force of nature. When the violence ended, two agents were unconscious. One had a dislocated shoulder, and Marcus stood in the center of the alley holding three weapons and breathing normally. He knelt beside the leader, who was conscious but dazed, blood trickling from his nose. Now we're going to have a different conversation, Marcus said calmly. You're going to tell me who sent you, why they want me gone, and how to make sure they never threaten innocent people again. The leader tried to maintain his defiance. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how powerful. Marcus pressed a pressure point on the man's neck, cutting off the blood flow to his brain for just long enough to make his point. When he released the pressure, the leader gasped and looked up at him with new understanding. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Marcus said. "The question is whether you're smart enough to cooperate or stupid enough to make me demonstrate more of what I learned during those missing 2 years in my service record." The leader's resistance crumbled. Over the next 15 minutes, Marcus extracted a complete confession. The 3 men worked for a private security company that contracted with various government agencies for off-the-books operations. They'd been hired to eliminate the potential embarrassment of a decorated SEAL working a mundane civilian job and drawing attention to classified programs. But more importantly, they'd been sent as a test. Someone wanted to know if Marcus Rivera was really just a harmless analyst or if the dangerous operative was still lurking beneath the surface. "Congratulations," the leader said bitterly as sirens began wailing in the distance. "You just proved them right." Marcus secured all 3 men with zip ties from their own equipment, then called 911 to report an attempted mugging behind the Starbucks. By the time police arrived, he'd constructed a plausible story about 3 men trying to rob him and is acting in self-defense. The responding officers were skeptical at first. 3 professional-looking men seemed unlikely muggers, but the physical evidence supported Marcus's account, and the men couldn't explain why they'd been carrying military-grade restraints and surveillance equipment. As the agents were loaded into police cars, Detective Kowalski arrived on the scene. He surveyed the situation with the experienced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of violence, then approached Marcus. "Hell of a thing," Kowalski said. 3 armed men and you walk away without a scratch." "I got lucky," Marcus replied. Kowalski nodded, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Funny thing about luck, Rivera. It tends to favor people who know what they're doing." After giving his statement and being cleared to leave, Marcus walked back toward the Starbucks. The coffee shop had been evacuated as a precaution, but Timothy Marsh was waiting outside, still shaken but unharmed. "Mr. Rivera," Marsh said, approaching cautiously. "Are you all right? The police said there was some kind of attack." "I'm fine," Marcus said. "But Mr. Marsh, I think it would be wise for you to drop your investigation, for your own safety." Marsh nodded quickly. "Already done. I'm going to tell Mr. Blackstone that I couldn't find anything useful and recommend he drop the matter entirely." As Marsh hurried away, Marcus stood on the sidewalk and considered his options. The attack had been a test, and he'd failed it by responding exactly as his opponents had hoped he would. By demonstrating that the dangerous operative was still alive under the analyst's exterior, he'd confirmed their worst fears about him. But he'd also sent a message. Anyone who threatened innocent people to get to him would find themselves dealing with someone far more dangerous than they'd bargained for. His phone buzzed with a text from Johnson. "Heard you had an interesting afternoon. We need to talk. Tonight." Marcus looked up at the Seattle skyline, at the city where he'd tried to build a quiet life, and realized that his time as the Invisible Man was over. The events of the past 2 days had shattered his carefully maintained cover, and there was no going back to the safety of anonymity. But maybe, he thought as he walked back to his car, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. For 8 years, he'd been living a half-life, hiding his true capabilities, pretending to be less than he was to avoid complications. The complications had found him anyway, and now that they had, he was going to handle them the way Marcus Rivera the SEAL would have handled them. Completely, decisively, and with whatever force was necessary to protect the people and principles he'd sworn to defend. The quiet man was gone. In his place stood someone who had been trained by the best military in the world to solve problems that couldn't be solved any other way. Richard Blackstone had wanted to know what weakness looked like. Instead, he'd awakened something that was about to show him, and anyone else who cared to find out, exactly what strength looked like when it finally decided to stop hiding. The hunt for Marcus Rivera was over. The hunt by Marcus Rivera was just beginning.